Hello and welcome to this special edition of Broadcast on WION. My name is Mohammed Saleh. Now, Russian forces are advancing, taking the front lines deeper into the Ukrainian territory. The Ukrainian soldiers at this moment are scrambling in order to build fortified defense lines and to try and fend off the Russian attacks. According to reports that have come in, Russia wants to make use of this interval from now till the US military aid reaches the front lines to gain as much advantage as it can on the battlefield. So to tell us as to which way this war in Ukraine is going, we are joined by Professor David Dunn, who's a professor of international politics at the University of Birmingham, and is joining us live on this broadcast. Now, Professor Dunn, this is what the general chatter has been, that because the Western military aid to Ukraine over the course of the last 6 months had been very patchy, the Russians have managed to clearly push the Ukrainians onto the back foot. And now, even though the Western military alliance, that is the United States, has passed the military aid bill for Ukraine, there is still a bit of time that it would take for these Western American weapons to reach the Ukrainian battlefield, and the Russians want to take full advantage of it. How much advantage do you think the Russians could press forth in this case?
Well, the interesting thing is that the Russian gains, despite the lack of Western support, have been incredibly modest. What they have not done is take the major towns that they have been pushing for, Putin asked of his armed forces that they take more of the Donetsk, so he could announce it on the anniversary military parade on May 9th, but they hadn't got that to claim because they haven't done that. The Russians have been throwing huge amounts of manpower and what are referred to as meat attacks, whereby they actually throw human waves forward. The Russians have lost at least 50,000 dead and 300,000 casualties overall. But actually, the gains they have made have been relatively modest. The Ukrainians have despite the lack of Western support, despite the fact that the Russians have mobilized 470,000 troops into the field, this war is showing itself to be remarkably static. Right. And indeed the conflict is taking place elsewhere, with Ukraine striking deep 700 miles into Russia to destroy oil and gas refining plants, and actually denying Russia the ability to operate in the Black Sea by sinking a third of its naval units in the Black Sea. So the war is taking place on many fronts, and the central front is, as I say, rather static.
Right. It's interesting that you pointed out, as to how this war is unfolding in many fronts. And on the Black Sea front, the Ukrainians, even though they do not have a naval force to speak of, have managed to sink almost about a third of the Russian Black Sea fleet. But on the ground, though, the Russians have made slow but steady progress, and the Ukrainian commanders are now saying that it is literally impossible for them to hold the positions that they hold at this moment. And therefore, in the course of the next few weeks, if the American military weapons do not reach them quickly enough, they say that they would have to fall back. What's your assessment on that front?
Yes, again, most military assessments say that. And in fact, the American White House spokesman, Jake Sullivan, said that the Ukrainian counteroffensive will not start until 2025. So there will be a bit of fluidity on the battlefield. But what there isn't is a major breakthrough. This war has been going on now for years, and the characteristics of that war is a huge Russian gains initially, massive pushback by the Ukrainians, and then a largely static battlefield with a bit of movement back and forth. There may well be an expectation that the Russians will gain some ground in the summer months, but that's not regarded as either strategically significant or actually a permanent loss of that territory, because once the Western support comes in, once Ukraine finishes its second round of mobilization, the expectation is that the Russians will be pushed back further. But this is likely to happen over several years, right, and therefore we shouldn't be over-fixated about the next few weeks.
As you are saying that this could drag on for the next several years, but this is the kind of battle that Russians would want to fight. This is a war of attrition where Russia is hoping, because the Western support for Ukraine has been on and off, at the best of times, that Russia is hoping that as the months go by, the Western support for Ukraine will wane again. and then Russia will gain its advantage. Do you think that actually plays into the Russian hands?
Well, the big question here is Mr. Trump and what he would do if he was elected in November. But what's interesting about the aid package passed through the US Congress is that it went through largely with Trump's blessing. And what that indicates is that support for Ukraine in the country is such that a huge majority of members of Congress actually in the end supported that aid package. And
right.
Trump, who has no principles, actually recognized that actually it was popular to support the war in Ukraine, and therefore the Western support for Ukraine in Europe and America is now established, and this blip in support is likely to be an exception rather than the rules. So the strategic aspects of this are that support in Europe and America, financial support and military support, and superior economic support and superior military technology will mean ultimately that Russia will not prevail. I mean, Russia has many advantages, including the fact that India and China buy its oil and break sanctions, and therefore its economy is keeping going in a way in which that wasn't expected before the war. But ultimately,
Professor Dunn, if I can just interject there, the fact that the Europeans have been purchasing oil and they've only now started talking about sanctioning LNG that is purchased by the Europeans from Russia. It's the European economy that has been financing the Russian war machine. Would you not agree to that?
No,
purchasing the Russian hydrocarbons. Now, the Europeans have been talking a lot as to how China and India have been purchasing oil and gas from the Russians. But the fact is, Europeans have been doing way more purchase of the Russian gas and Russian oil than India and China have.
We can dispute that. Most of oil exports to Europe and gas exports to Europe have stopped. There's one or two countries that are still reliant on Russian hydrocarbons, but most analysts would say that the biggest issue is China and India, particularly India refining petrol and selling that on as refined oil and selling that on as diesel, that actually are effectively sustaining the ability of Russia to wage this aggression. It may not be a thing that the Indians want to hear, but that's what most analysts are arguing.
But, that's of course a point of debate. The Indians would of course turn around and say that the Europeans are still purchasing, even though the Europeans are the ones who are imposing sanctions on Russia not to purchase Russian LNG and gas. The fact is Europe still continues to make purchases from the Russians of LNG, and this is something that's been very widely
on a tiny scale.
But let me
on a tiny scale.
Professor Dunn, let's in fact come back to what is happening on the battlefield in Ukraine. Now, when you say that Donald Trump did agree to send this tranche of military aid to the Ukrainians, the fact is a lot of the Ukrainian defenders would be looking at the way Donald Trump has behaved in the past. Let's say, assuming that there's a change of guard at the White House later this year in the month of November, how confident do you think the Ukrainians would be to rely on Donald Trump as a reliable partner in taking on and fighting off the Russians?
Well, there's two things here. I mean, it would require Donald Trump to win, and that's by no means a certainty. His trials and him being portrayed as a sleazy individual through the process in New York will undoubtedly affect his popularity in America. But if he were to win in November and take office in January, there are many people who have concerns about this. But as I say, the interesting thing with regard to Trump is that he actually has switched position on most issues, including abortion and a whole variety of other things, when he sees what is popular. Right. And what is clear from this time is that actually support for Ukraine is popular. So despite the concerns that many have, it may well be that if Trump were to take office in January, actually he would follow the popularity of support for Ukraine rather than necessarily being someone who was opposed to that. But these are many speculations with 6 or 9 months to wait. In the meantime, the Europeans have pledged long-term commitments. Both the EU and the UK have said that they will give billions of dollars and pounds and euros to Ukraine for however long the war takes. Right. And that commitment is what Ukraine wants to hear.
All right. Now, the French President Emmanuel Macron has been repeatedly saying that French soldiers may have to fight in the Ukrainian battlefield. If that were to happen, do you think this is a contest that would directly become a contest between Russia and the NATO military alliance?
That's a real possibility. What Macron has done is actually try and raise an area of ambiguity with regard to what the European states should do. And there was a debate whether European states could send their armed forces in a way not necessarily to fill frontline positions, but to give supporting roles to Ukraine. In international law, Ukraine is entitled to actually ask for support from its allies and to act in collective self-defense and call for collective self-defense. So international law and international politics would make this feasible. But Macron's suggestion is not one that's widely supported in Europe or within NATO, so it's unlikely to happen in the short term. But he's raising it as a possibility more than actually a plan.
Now, Professor Dunn, my final question to you is twofold. Firstly, the Russians have said that it has become necessary for them to fight this war in Ukraine because the West has not recognized the security concerns of Russia, because they've been trying to push the NATO military alliance's frontier as eastward as possible. That is the reason why the Russians say they are in Ukraine in the first place. Secondly, considering what's been happening in the last fortnight, where Russia has carried out military drills of tactical nuclear weapons that say may come into picture if this war continues to drag on, how concerned do you think the military strategists in the West would be of this war, in fact, resulting in the use of tactical nuclear weapons?
Well, first of all, the question of NATO expansion. The reason why many of Russia's neighbors sought as sovereign states to join NATO was their security concerns about the behavior of Russia and in annexing part of Georgia in 2008 and illegally occupying the Crimea in 2014. And of course, the latest two countries to join NATO, Sweden and Finland, did so as a direct result of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2021. So what we see there is not a case of the West expanding NATO to threaten Russia, but actually sovereign states being concerned for their security and seeking an alliance from like-minded democratic states next to them. So the idea that Russia is the victim in this is a topsy-turvy view of the situation. The reason why they have sought that security is because of the aggressive territorial expansionist imperialist aims of Russia. With regard to the nuclear question, this is same old from Russia. We've heard this from the very start of this illegal invasion, that actually if you respond to this in any way, I reserve the right to use nuclear weapons. What's interesting is that despite the initial concerns about supplying anything to Ukraine, as Russia has escalated in a whole variety of ways in its aggression against Ukraine, the West has been emboldened to aid Ukraine in increasing ways with different levels of technology and other forms of military and economic aid. That hasn't triggered a Russian use of nuclear weapons. And indeed, the Chinese have made it clear to the Russians that to do so would mean that they would withdraw any support for them, because that would be to cross a bridge too far. So that the threats, I think, from Russia are ones that you've seen in that wider context and as saber rattling rather than anything else.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. We're completely out of time. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Dunn, for joining us and getting us that perspective there.
Always a pleasure.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.